I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. To many, Venezuela seems to have become the latest setting of the new Cold War between Russia and the U.S. Russia has warned the U.S. against intervening in Venezuela. Trump says he will defend democracy, human rights, and freedom at any cost. The two powers disagree also over Syria, Ukraine, Iran, and have also walked away from a long-standing missile treaty. As the stakes continue to be heightened, in today's program, we'll discuss the dangers of this global Russia-U.S. standoff. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by Mr. Daniel Sierra, who is a political strategist. He's joining us live now from Caracas. He's director of the think tank Venezuela Idea Lab. We're also joined by Mr. Ahmed Kaballo, who is a journalist who is currently in Caracas in Venezuela as well. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Daniel, I'll start with you, if I may. What do you make of Russia's warning to the United States to not intervene in Venezuela?
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. I think it is a wise advice in general for foreign powers not to intervene in a situation that is led by the Venezuelan people. This political process that we're having right now in Venezuela is led by the National Assembly, which is the Congress of Venezuela. It is a constitutional process that we are having in the country. Okay. And I think it's wise that Russia actually says this phrase. We believe that no foreign intervention should occur, and that this process should continue to be led by the Venezuelan people through its elected officials that are in the National Congress.
Ahmed, what do you make of that? Because you're on the ground there too, Ahmed. You've been observing things. What do you make of how Venezuelans feel about any foreign intervention?
Out that showed that 86% of the Venezuelan population are against military intervention. 81% oppose U.S. sanctions. And I think 71% support the idea of negotiations pushed forward by Mexico and Uruguay. If I could just respond to what my colleague said.
Sure.
So he said that foreign intervention is wrong and that it should be led by the Venezuelan people. I agree. In any country, if you want democratic change, whether it's Sudan or Venezuela, it needs to be led by foreign people. However, the problem in Venezuela is it hasn't been led by Venezuelans. Now, the USA has been trying to conduct a regime change ever since Hugo Chavez was elected in 1999, or came into power in 1999. Yeah. And what we got was the international coalition led by the United States recognizing somebody that wasn't elected. And Juan Guaido claims that he wants to be interim president. Yeah. But yet we hear him making statements about Venezuela's future foreign policy. We hear him making statements about Venezuela's national assets. So to me, he's clearly not trying to lead a transitional government. He's trying to be the new president of Venezuela. And what the international coalition have done is actually very dangerous, because Venezuela is divided. There are pro-Maduro supporters and anti-Maduro supporters. But an international coalition has put all of its efforts and support behind the anti-Maduro supporters, which only lays the groundwork for further conflict in the future.
Daniel, what do you make of that? Do you agree that it already seems, Daniel, that the U.S. is already involved? It's already interfered in this situation.
Well, I believe that foreign intervention started a while ago, actually 15 years ago, with Cuban intervention in the security services of Venezuela. This has been an intervention led by several thousand Cuban security operatives in the Venezuelan security services, and it should stop. No one likes foreign intervention. We believe that all foreign intervention should be discarded, and that the process should be led by the Venezuelan people. I want to build on something Ahmed said, and I'm very happy that he is in the country seeing the situation with his eyes. So it's very clear the humanitarian crisis that we're living, and it is that Juan Guaido, the president of the National Congress, is executing the authority granted by the Constitution, which clearly says, and this happens in every country, if there is no elected president, no elected vice president, the president of Congress assumes the executive powers of the republic.
But to be fair, Daniel, Maduro would obviously disagree with you on that point, wouldn't he? He would say that he is the elected president.
Well, but he is not. He tried to make a sham election last year, but nobody in the world, more than 50 countries in the world, didn't recognize this sham election. Actually, he banned opposition candidates to run against him. Not only opposition candidates, but all the political parties to run against him. This was a complete sham election. Nobody believed it. So there is no elected president in Venezuela. And the president of Congress, which was elected by the people, by the Constitution, assumes power in the country. This is not an intervention of a foreign power. This is strictly constitutional law in Venezuela. And the president of National Congress is the president of Venezuela, Ahmed. It's not that we're trying to think that we are executing the Constitution that says that the president of the National Assembly.
So let me just get Ahmed to respond to that, because I know Ahmed has been speaking to people on the streets, as I'm sure you have, Daniel. Ahmed, tell us about how people feel about this whole issue of the Constitution and how Guaido is convinced, as his supporters are, that he is rightfully the president according to the Constitution.
Well, speaking to people on the ground, one way they describe Nicolas Maduro is the constitutional president, and they remind Juan Guaido of the Constitution. Now, your colleague says it was sham elections. I've spoken to international observers that observed the elections, as well as I think Jimmy Carter said about the electoral system in Venezuela, that it's the best in the world. You need a fingerprint scanner. That needs to then be verified. You need your voter ID. The idea that these elections were a sham when Nicolas Maduro got 6 million votes out of an eligible 20 million votes. Now, the opposition boycotted the elections, and the reason why the opposition boycotted the elections, in many people's eyes, is because they knew they couldn't win. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't anti-Maduro supporters. I think overall in the country, there might be just as many, if not more, anti-Maduro supporters than there are pro-Maduro supporters. The issue the opposition got is that the opposition is divided. So it's not that there isn't people that are against Maduro. It's that there isn't one candidate that they're willing to put their support behind. Juan Guaido, one thing that people keep telling me is how young he is. He's just a boy. What does he know about politics? I don't think he is even the best amongst the opposition. He represents the fringe right of the opposition coalition, a very violent right-wing opposition that in an actual general election wouldn't garner more votes than President Nicolas Maduro.
Daniel, obviously we can talk a lot about internal Venezuelan politics, till we run out of breath, Daniel. But do you think that Venezuelans realize, Daniel, that this is more than just about Venezuela itself? This seems larger, doesn't it? The larger geopolitical implications to all of this. And we can talk about, as I did in my introduction, the Cold War that continues between Russia and the United States, that this is a lot to do with the United States trying to ensure that it maintains influence over Latin America. This is bigger than just one country. Do you see it that way as well, Daniel?
I agree that there is a global contest of power, and Venezuela, being part of the world, obviously falls into this competition. However, I disagree that the United States is trying to influence a political outcome. The United States and the rest of the region is behind a strategy of supporting Venezuelan democracy. Because in the end, as we were saying before, this is a constitutional-led process by the Venezuelan people through its elected officials. So it's not just the United States. It's more than 50 countries, both in Latin America and in Europe and in Asia as well, that recognize President Juan Guaido as the interim president of the republic. And so it's not just the United States and Russia. And by the way, Maduro only has Russia behind, and Cuba, which is sad. I understand that Russia would be maybe scared if there is a change of government that maybe their investments are not going to be
but to be fair, if I may, Daniel, to be fair to Russia and others, they've only called for dialogue. Russia has not necessarily taken a specific side. I mean, Russia's called for dialogue, and this is something, by the way, that Guaido has refused. Guaido refused offers of dialogue even from Mexico and Uruguay.
Well, I think you have to know a little bit of the history of the dialogue process in Venezuela. We have permanently being on a dialogue process with the government, and even the Pope yesterday sent a letter to Maduro saying that he doesn't fulfill his promises in the dialogue. So this is not a process that we are against. We are totally for a negotiation process in which constitutional order is restored by Maduro ceasing to usurp the power that he is illegally usurping. However, I want to go back to the Russia issue, but because I don't think it's true that they're only calling for a dialogue. They are supporting the dictatorship. They are directly supporting the dictatorship through political training, through financing, through military equipment. And I believe, as I was saying, that there is a legitimate interest of Russia in Venezuela because they have 5 big oil development projects in Venezuela. What Juan Guaido, President Juan Guaido has said very clearly is that we are willing to respect all these investments, that they should not be afraid, that their political transition in Venezuela will occur and that they will be part of the...
Okay, I just have to take a very short break, Daniel. I will, of course, be back in right after that break. We will continue, ladies and gentlemen, to discuss the more geopolitical implications of the situation in Venezuela between, of course, the Russia and United States and the continuing global Cold War between those two powers. We'll be right back after this break. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, here in The Scope as we continue to discuss the continuing Cold War between Russia and the United States. Seemingly, the latest setting, we can argue, maybe Venezuela at this time. We still have Daniel and Ahmed with us, and we're not going to join and add another voice to this conversation. We're also now joined by Dr. Mikael Wigell, who is a political analyst. He's joining us from Helsinki. He's Senior Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Ahmed, let me ask you then, as we were talking with Daniel about right before we went to break, what do you make of the geopolitical implications? And do you think that Venezuelans on the ground realize the larger game that may be played here?
They 100% realize. So I went to Bolivar Square in Caracas, where there was queues of people waiting for hours upon hours, day by day, to sign a document against US intervention, Western intervention. Now, the opposition try to pretend these people don't exist, these people are invisible, but they're there for everybody to see. And I just can't get over the idea that the United States is not invested in regime change, that it just wants to support democracy. This is just nonsense. I don't want to be disrespectful to your to my colleague, but it is just nonsense. Why has this been led by John Bolton, Elliot A. Trump, the most right-wing fanatics from Washington? Why has everyone should read the Grey Zone article on Juan Guaido, where it says Juan Guaido has been nurtured for over 15 years by Washington for this particular process. He might come out of nowhere for Venezuelans and for the international press, but Washington has been nurturing this guy for this particular process.
But Ahmed, also, I wonder how, Ahmed, you would, just if I may push you on that point, just if I may play devil's advocate. As you well know, Ahmed, there are a lot of grievances towards Maduro. We can talk about, of course, the very high inflation rate, the shortages of food, medicine, etc., which I'm positive you've witnessed as well on the ground there. Tell us about that side of things as well, because that does then show, what is happening and the grievances on the other side that may push someone to support Guaido.
There are grievances, there are shortages, although I do think the shortages are exaggerated. Since I've been walking around, I've saw McDonald's, TGI Fridays, Wendy's, various restaurants, food. I've been eating great food. But anyway, there are grievances, like there are grievances in the United Kingdom, like there are grievances in the United States. And I think the reason why these grievances happen is because it's US foreign policy. Now, Richard Nixon said in 1973 that he was going to make the Chile economy scream, so the Chile people would turn against the democratically elected president, Salvador Allende. And that's what happened. And then they supported a coup in which it led to 30 years of dictatorship by Augusto Pinochet. And I think this is trademark foreign policy. You make the people suffer, you make them suffer economically so that they place the blame on their ruling government and they turn against the ruling government. But unfortunately for Venezuelans, the people that have turned against the ruling government aren't the poor who would feel the hardship the most. It's the middle classes. I'll mention one quick thing. Now, I've walked around, I've spoken to scores and scores of people. What you find is the darker the people are, the poorer the people are, the more likely they are to be Chavistas. The whiter the people are, the more middle class the people are, such as your colleague, they're more likely to support the opposition. And it shows to me this is about class interest more than it is about...
All right, so let me put that point then, Ahmed. We're now joined by Mikael, who is now with us on the line. Mikael, thanks for joining us and for taking your time out to join us here in The Scope. I wonder, Mikael, what you make of the situation in Venezuela as you observe it from afar. We, of course, have Russia warning the United States not to intervene militarily. Many people saying the U.S. already, though, is involved heavily here on the side of Guaido.
Well, I think Russia's recent warning, has a couple of motives. First is simply to showcase Russia's presence in Venezuela. Russia wants to portray itself as a global power, and it has, and it's in this way it's able to portray itself as having a geopolitical foothold even in Latin America, which is kind of Washington's backyard, so to speak. A second motive is of this warning is really to drive a wedge between the U.S. and the rest of the coalition supporting Juan Guaido, so Europe and most of Latin America. A U.S. military intervention has no support whatsoever from these other states. So Russia wants to play up this possibility of a U.S. intervention so as to drive a wedge between its U.S. and its other Europe and Latin America. And a third motive is just to up the stakes a bit for a military intervention. Russia has deep interests in Venezuela, and it doesn't want U.S. to intervene. It doesn't want Maduro to fall. It's trying to do what it can to prop up the Maduro regime.
Okay, so Daniel, I wonder what you make of Elliot Abrams. He's been made the special envoy for Venezuela, the U.S. special envoy, that is, for Venezuela. We all know Elliot Abrams' background, of course, when it comes to El Salvador and the murdering gangs there at that time during the 1980s, which Elliot Abrams was involved in and was even charged with really in that case. Do you think, Daniel, that is the healthy way to go, that sort of an appointment goes to show what the real intentions of the U.S. are?
I respect the U.S. internal policy decisions, and in this case, this was the State Department decision to appoint Mr. Abrams as a special representative, and I think he is a person with experience. Yesterday was very interesting in Congress, where the discussion that was led, and actually the issue of Russian interference was raised several times by different representatives. And I think this is a very important issue, going back to what your colleague was saying about the interest of the Russian Federation in Venezuela. We believe that Russia Federation will continue having an interest in Venezuela when the democratic transition finally occurs. There is no way that this fear will materialize. We will respect the legal rights of the different investments that were acquired legally through the process, and Russia will retain their oil investment interest. And I think this is fundamental because nobody here is speaking about not recognizing this interest. This is very important to to mention many times, Mr. Waqar, because sometimes this is portrayed by the international media as this is some kind of a revolution. No, this is a normal constitutional democratic process that is based on the Constitution, and it's legal. Okay. And we are in the process of recognizing all the legal rights of all international investors in Venezuela. And I believe this has to be very clear for all your international audience.
You know, Ahmed, it's not just economic relations, is it, Ahmed, between Russia and Venezuela, which I imagine Russia is concerned about. But obviously, Russia has also, had and has military ties, which are very significant with Venezuela. Russia even possibly placing 2 supersonic bombers in Venezuela at some point in time. All of that shows very close relations, don't they, between Russia and Venezuela. What does that say to you?
It does show close relations, and Venezuela is a key ally in the region for Russia. But also Russia supports the idea of non-intervention. Now, it isn't for the United States to decide the future of Venezuela. Now, you talked about Elliot Abrams, and your colleague said he respects the decision and he respects his experience. He's a murderous fanatic, and the fact that he's been appointed in that position shows the intention of the United States. What happens with these situations when it comes to Latin America? They want us to have amnesia. They want us to forget everything that happened before and start afresh and deal with it. No, we can't start afresh. We see the resume, not just of the United States, but of the individuals involved in the policy towards Venezuela. And it indicates the past is a good indicator towards the future. And we cannot forget who these people are and what they've done. And I can't imagine any political analyst, apart from the one that you've got on your show, that says they respect his experience. His experience is one of shame. And if he wasn't an American citizen, he wouldn't be allowed into America. He wouldn't get a visa into America because of his criminal record. Yet somehow he's leading the kind of policy decisions towards another sovereign.
Mikael, I wonder what you make of Elliot Abrams and that appointment, because certainly I imagine, Mikael, that there were others to choose from. Why choose somebody so controversial? Do you think that Bolton and Trump and the others are trying to almost make a point here that they want somebody like Abrams, who is that controversial, who has that kind of a criminal background, to be in such a sensitive position?
I think certainly President Trump is signaling very forcefully with the nomination of Elliot Abrams that the military option is a real option. That's the purpose of taking him on board to be the special envoy on Venezuela. It's really to signal that they're serious, that the military intervention is a serious option that they are considering. Now, I know from some of my sources in the U.S. administration that there are many in the administration that are of very different opinion, that are trying to persuade Trump not to play up this option, not to talk so much about this military intervention.
Mikael, we'll have to leave that as our final word, but of course we do appreciate all of our guests and the insight analysis they brought to this specific segment of the program. Let me thank them from the top. That was Dr. Mikael Wigell, political analyst, speaking to us from Helsinki, senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. We also had Mr. Ahmed Kaballo, journalist who is currently in the Venezuelan capital, Caracas. And we were also joined by Daniel Sierra, political strategist, director of the think tank Venezuela Idea Lab, and he was also speaking to us from the Venezuelan capital. Now, viewers, as our guests there all spoke about, and we spoke specifically, of course, about what's happening there in Venezuela and what this means between the Russia and the United States in this continuing, seemingly Cold War that one can argue is continuing there in that latest setting in Latin America. We'll continue to discuss this in our next segment. We're going to take a broader worldview now on the standoff between Russia and the U.S. worldwide. Stay with us for that. Thank you very much for staying with us, viewers, here in The Scope. As we continue to talk about this seemingly Cold War that continues around the world between Russia and the United States. In this segment, we're going to add completely new voices. We're joined by Mr. Luciano Zaccara, who is a political analyst. He's joining us from Doha. He's a research assistant professor in Gulf politics at Qatar University. We're also joined by Mr. Pavel Sharikov, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute for USA and Canada Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. He is joining us from Moscow now. Pavel and Luciano, thanks for joining us. Luciano, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What are your thoughts about what's happening, if we were to start just from the most recent of events and settings in Venezuela, for example, between Russia and the United States? That seems to be a standoff, which is a continuation, isn't it, of what's happened in Syria, what's happened in Ukraine, etc.
Yeah, it could be possible to analyze it through these lenses. I mean, Latin American history of relations with the United States has been always very controversial in the last century. So the fact that there is a government that is now contested by part of the opposition, and the fact that there is a group of countries or governments that are more leftist or populist, that they are supporting Maduro, while on the other hand we have Trump and other group of countries, including the European Union, that they don't recognize Maduro, makes this confrontation to become much more internationally wide than any other conflicts in the Latin American countries since the times of the revolution of Nicaragua and the Russian and the Cuban Revolution. So, of course, the fact that Russia is engaging in this conflict as well is providing more bilateral or bipolar confrontation on something that this should have been solved internally, unfortunately.
All right, so Luciano, I wonder though, when we're talking about, we can talk about military and economic ties of Russia to a place like Venezuela. We can even talk about those ties elsewhere, for example, even Syria, really. That's all playing with fire, isn't it, when the U.S. goes against that directly in some ways?
Trying to influence events on other countries, on the third countries. Latin America has been always the backyard of the United States, or at least this is the way the United States consider Latin America since the 19th century. So every time there is one problem, or the Cuban Revolution, the Nicaraguan Revolution, the populist governments that they mushroom in Latin America, or even this case, is now dealt as a matter of security, internal security for the United States, and that's why they are reacting in a so aggressive way, and they see that the support of Russia and other countries to Venezuela is not a matter of Latin American affairs, it's also an American, North American affair.
Right. Okay, let me add other voices to this conversation. We're joined by Holami, who is a political analyst who is joining us from Tehran. We're also joined by, as I introduced him earlier, Pavel Sharikov, senior research fellow at the Institute for USA and Canada Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences, who is joining us from Moscow. Thank you both for joining us. Hadi, I'll start with you, if I may. What do you make of Russia and USA's disagreement, for example, over Iran? We had and we have now this summit taking place in Poland. And at the same time, on the same day, essentially, we've had this attack in Iran as well, which President Rouhani has linked with that meeting in Poland. What are your thoughts about that, Hadi?
To actually assess the actual situation, we have to look back at the history that has been first between the US and Iran, and then Iran and Russia. In the past, after the revolution, let's say, Iran has been much more close to Russia than to the United States, and Iran being actually the policeman, let's say, as they used to say, the gendarme of the United States in the region during the Shah regime. The geopolitical balance has changed in the region, and the thing is, when Iran used to be an ally of the US here, and there used to be much less confrontation, this has now changed. Iran has been more inclined towards Russia. And that's the thing I want to say here is that right now, that during the Obama era, the US administration was much more, let's say, much less aggressive than the Donald Trump's administration. And much of the attacks we are seeing here, we weren't seeing them before. And much of the, let's say, regionalist or separatist movements or militias that are active in the southern regions weren't active before. The same thing is happening. Then with the conference, the U.S. is trying to rally up more countries, but actually unsuccessfully.
Okay, so let's discuss that further. Let me bring in Pavel as well. Pavel, what thoughts about the fact that Russia was against this conference in Poland to begin with, in fact? Russia being against, of course, America's policies towards Iran, as an example, of course, of the disagreements that those two countries have over global policies.
The United States are getting more and more into further political contradictions, and the more different events happening in the world, the more new points of disagreement appear in Russian-American relations. We were talking about Iran, right?
Yes.
Well, Iran is a clear case which appeared in Russian-American relations long before the so-called Ukrainian crisis, which happened after 2014. So this is not news in any way. Plus, Iran, according to the opinion of many experts, Iran benefited from American actions in Iraq after 2003, and Iran actually gained certain strength, which the United States were definitely unhappy with. So right now, this is a region where the United States have certain tensions. And did I hear correctly that you've also mentioned Poland?
Yes. We mentioned that meeting there in Poland, of course, it's occurring today. The Iranian president, as you know, Pavel, linking what's happened in Poland with the conference and the attack within Iran, something, of course, that Russia, of course, didn't even agree with the conference to begin with.
Yeah, I didn't connect Poland with this particular case because I thought you were discussing Poland as a territory for placing the American ballistic missile systems, which Russia also perceives as a threat.
Of course, yes. Let me bring in Luciano then. Luciano, if I may, I wanted to get your thoughts, Luciano, on the attack that's happened in Iran. And, of course, the Iranians connecting that directly to what the conference in Poland. The Russians obviously disagreed with that conference to begin with. Is that another, do you think, front here that continues to foster at this point in time a disagreement between these countries? And how dangerous is that? Because it does seem that America is playing with fire, isn't it?
Well, and there are two things here. One is the attack that occurred in Iraq yesterday, and this is part of an offensive that has been going on in Iran since a long time ago. Some groups, Yundullah or other groups that they split from that main group, that they are organizing terrorist attacks against the government, or again the Pasdaran, or again even civilians or policemen in the south of Iran, in Balochistan, basically. I'm not quite sure this is absolutely related with what happened in Poland, even though some officials say that it's not. Even the president Rouhani says that it's not a coincidence that this happened at this time. It could be, but I'm not quite sure that it's possible, because there was another terrorist attack in the same province last 2 weeks ago. So I think this is part of a bigger conflict that is inside Iran. There was an Ahbaz a few months ago, another terrorist attack against the military. Yes. So this is part of a bigger picture that is difficult to link with what is going on in Poland right now. But what is going on in Poland right now is certainly, I think, one of the biggest mistakes of the United States foreign policy in the Middle East. And what it's showing is that nobody is following what the United States is doing. It was clearly, even though they changed the title of the conference, it was clearly oriented to create the front against Iran. Yeah. And the tweet that then Netanyahu posted yesterday, this morning, and he had to change very quickly because he put war against Iran, and then they complain about the translation, whatever. Yeah. It was clearly organized in terms of, we need to stop Iran and we need to fight against Iran. And this, of course, Russia, not only Russia, but China, Qatar, and other countries from the Middle East, and European Union, nobody agrees on that. Nobody agrees on a front or on a conference thought to start a war, when the only country that left the JCPOA was the United States. Russia, China, and the European Union are still there. Mogherini decided not to go to that conference. So it's clearly an attempt that was followed only by Saudi Arabia and by Israel. So,
okay.
I mean,
let me bring in Pavel, if you allow me, Luciano, here. I wanted to ask then, if we can, let's talk about the fact that instability seems to follow wherever the U.S. gets involved. So we can talk about Syria, for example. We can even talk about Ukraine if we want, and the instability that has created, especially in East Ukraine. Do you think that is something that concerns Russia? And is that the main reason why do you think that Russia has gotten involved in specifically, of course, Syria, and possibly why Russia is also standing by Iran?
Well, that's a very interesting observation, that instability comes wherever the United States come. I don't think that there is a pattern. I think that every case has its own very unique features, and it would be wrong to accuse the United States of bringing instability on purpose.
Okay.
It's just they are trying to interfere in different ways in different countries. Sometimes they're more successful, sometimes they're not successful, and many different factors appear.
If I may bring you back in and then ask you about Syria specifically, Luciano, it seemed that obviously the United States had a very specific policy, even under Obama, towards Syria. Obviously, its official policy was the ouster of Bashar al-Assad. Do you think, A, that the U.S. has lost in that regard specifically, and that B, that Russia, by coming in and supporting the Assad government, has essentially gotten the upper hand of that specific situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think the United States had a very clear policy since the times of Obama of what to do in Syria. And I think this was the worst problem, that they had no clear idea how to get rid of Assad without getting involved in a more complicated scenario like it happened in Iraq. Obama tried to prevent this to happen. Trump, we don't know exactly what he thinks. I mean, the fact that he's claiming that during his term, ISIS was defeated, when it's true that only when Russia entered in the scene in Syria, ISIS started to be defeated inside Syria, not in the Iraqi scenario, which is something different. And there, United States was much more involved with the support to the Kurds and also with the contribution of the Iranian forces. Yeah. But the Syrian scenario is absolutely totally different. And it's true that the Russian involvement moved the balance to the Assad side. But I'm not quite sure what is in the head of Trump on his strategy in Syria, because even his own military advisors and generals are against this decision of pulling out from Syria.
Okay, so let's add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by John Hasasu, a political analyst. He's joining us now from Istanbul. John, thanks for joining us here in The Scope and for taking your time out. I wonder what you make, John, about what's happened specifically in Syria, where the Russians, of course, came in around 2015, and the American policy, of course, from day one was the ouster of Bashar al-Assad. That seemingly has not occurred. Do you think that the Russians have essentially then gained an upper hand in that situation?
Well, since the Russians came into Syria physically with their army, putting their power, supporting the Syrian regime in 2015, of course, everything changed. Actually, the balance is going towards the Russian side and their Iranian allies. So, indeed, the involvement of the Russian power in the clashes in Syria change everything, and we're experiencing that actually. Russia not being foreign to the region and to its politics is coming back. If we remember, go back to the Gulf War. During the Gulf War, Russia wasn't capable of involving strong enough in what's going on in Iraq. But now, during the Syrian civil war, Everything is changing, and Russia is trying to go back to its old pace and relations in the region. So Syria definitely place being very familiar to the Russians,
Right.
and their entry with their armed forces into the fight here, of course, changed many things in their favor.
Okay, so Pavel, I wonder what you make of why Russia has taken such an assertive role, even in the Middle East region, getting involved in Syria, getting closer to even a NATO ally such as Turkey. What do you think the Russian calculus is, Pavel, about the situation in the Middle East?
Well, I think that Russian position on the Middle East have been pretty clear throughout all the years, and it looks like Russia sticks to this position despite many different factors that are changing. So, yeah, I was trying to finish my thought when I got disconnected. That
yes, go ahead.
While the United States interfere in many domestic affairs in many different places around the world, Russia really reacts really dramatically in cases where Russian interests are being involved. So Syria is definitely one of those cases because Syria, Russia invested a lot into Syrian economy, and Russia had a lot of assets also related to oil and gas assets in Syria, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And so definitely this is a case for Russia, to a certain extent, defending its interests, its assets in Syria. Obviously, if the Assad regime would fall and the United States would be able to install another regime, another leader, he would definitely be against Russia, and Russian leaders realize that this is not according to their interests.
Okay, so
I don't think I can say anything more than that.
Sure. So Luciano, I wonder what you think. If, for example, we're talking about the relations even with Turkey or other such countries, where Russia seems to now be coming in and becoming ever more, coming into even greater partnership, if I may use that term, with countries such as Turkey or even others in this region, really, where it's selling arms and getting involved in deals, etc. Do you think that Russia realizes that it needs to have its stake and to mark its territory in that sense?
Yeah, definitively. I mean, Russia is trying to be more pragmatic in its relation with the Middle East. It's trying to base its relations with all the countries in the Middle East on in terms of interest, in terms of economic interest. I mean, if you see, there are a lot of political relations between Russia and other countries, but so far it's difficult to find Russian products in the Middle East because, I mean, there's not that much big trade exchange between the Middle East and Russia, even though, and also because the economies of Russia and some Middle East oil producers are competitive, so they are not trading oil with Russia. So Russia needs to create this interest. It needs to create needs for exchange between, for instance, GCC states or Iran or Iraq with Russia in terms of what they can provide to each other. And so far, this relation did not exist. So the only link that Russia had with all this regime was, or is starting to be mainly defense agreements, provision of missiles or other kind of armaments to Qatar, Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. So, but this is a way also to confront United States in the region, because the United States, with all the initiatives, the MESA initiative, for instance, is trying to become again the only provider of security and defense for all the Middle East, and of course this will push Russia outside the market again.
Yeah. So John, I wonder what you make, John, about, for example, the change in the relations between Turkey and Russia over these years, ever since, of course, that coup occurred, or the failed coup attempt, that is, in Turkey occurred. It seems that Russia and Turkey have gotten quite close, even though, of course, Turkey is still a member of NATO as well. Do you think that goes to show the growing Russian influence versus possibly a less American influence over Turkey?
Well, when people talk about Russian-U.S. relationship, there is always a Cold War in the DNA of the talk. So because of that DNA, something which is like a cooperation of a NATO power with Russia in the region could look strange, but I think we're witnessing a period which everything could change, and we shouldn't take the old measures to understand what's going on around us. And Turkey, of course, with them, after the failed coup attempt, had a very unique relationship with Moscow, and they have engagements in field of security in Syria and some other engagements in field of investments in the power side, like natural gas and nuclear plants, building the nuclear plant in Turkey as well. So technologically and security-wise, there are some new relations between Turkey and Russia. But as I said, even though it has something in its DNA coming from all the way from the Cold War, but in Russia, we shouldn't consider Russia as Russia. It's most of the time Putin and his team who are deciding the destiny of the country. So it's still developing. We shouldn't actually name it or frame it with what we know from before, I think. So it's natural but that these countries are doing some new agreements or partnerships, which is really different from what we used to know.
Okay, I'll give the final word to Pavel Sharikov. Pavel, I wanted to, and we haven't gotten to discuss this, the NATO issue in general, because obviously Russia has a lot of grievances towards NATO expansion, as it calls it. We obviously had the issue in Ukraine that occurred, is still continuing. Do you think that Russia has a fair point when it comes to its complaints about NATO expansion close to its borders?
Well, I think that throughout the recent 25, 30 years that Russia existed, the NATO expanded many times, and this is still a mystery, a historical mystery, whether Gorbachev reached these agreements with NATO leaders and with Western leaders, whether they are going to expand NATO or not. So it's really very weird, the kind of relations that have been developing throughout these decades, because on the one hand, Russia and NATO declared many times that they don't perceive each other as enemies. But at the same time, with every next step of NATO expansion, Russia protested and said that NATO is getting closer to its borders and they perceive this as a threat. So right now, obviously, the relations are very bad. The crisis is going on. And the more Ukraine and Georgia are willing to get into NATO, the more, aggressive Russia would talk, and the more threats Russian leaders would have. They would declare that this is obviously a threat. And it's very hard to say whose fault is it. And I'm not really sure that finding the person who is guilty of it is the proper way to solve the problem. So NATO is right now NATO is a big issue for Russia, that's for sure.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word, but of course we appreciate our guests for their analysis and insight that they brought to this discussion. Let me thank them from the top. We were joined there right at the end by Mr. Pavel Sharikov, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for USA and Canada Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences, who was speaking to us from Moscow. We were also joined by John Hasasu, political analyst, speaking to us from Istanbul. We were earlier joined by Mr. Hadi Ghulami, who is a political analyst. He had been speaking to us from Tehran. And we were also joined by Mr. Luciano Zaccara, political analyst, speaking to us from Doha. He's a research assistant professor in Gulf politics at Qatar University. Now, viewers, we got through quite a few of the spheres of conflict that may exist between Russia and the United States globally. We can talk about Venezuela, Syria, Iran, and of course NATO expansion close to Russia's borders, amongst many others. We weren't able to talk about the INF Treaty, but that of course is the big one as well. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on how relations between these two powers develop going forward, as well as what happens in the new settings that may be set up where these two may disagree on what exactly happens globally. That we'll leave it there for now, though. For this point, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this has been Scope. Thanks for watching.